In the small town of Blackville, where the nights were darker than anywhere else, there lived a writer named Daniel Cartwright. His works, full of dark plots and mysterious characters, mesmerized readers, but Daniel himself was on the verge of madness. Every time he sat down at his old desk, he had the feeling that someone or something was watching him. One night, as the moon lit up his room, Daniel, exhausted from endlessly trying to finish his new novel, noticed an old book on the desk. It was coated in dust and its spine was covered in strange symbols. Intrigued, he opened it and found that the pages were filled with illegible texts and drawings. It was a book of ancient rituals. Daniel didn't pay much attention to it at first, but soon he began to notice that when he read some of the phrases aloud, his thoughts became clearer and the words formed sentences by themselves. He worked at night, and the more he immersed himself in the book, the more he became obsessed. His novel took a dark turn, and the characters began to seem real to him. Soon his work began to attract attention. One of his old friends, Jason, was the first to notice the change in Daniel. He came to visit him and was amazed at how his friend had changed. Daniel looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes, and his room was littered with empty bottles and papers with illegible notes. "Daniel, you need to rest. You look terrible," Jason said. But Daniel only grinned. "I'm close to being finished, Jason. It will be my masterpiece," he replied without looking away from his desk. Meanwhile, his obsession grew stronger every day. His characters began to manifest themselves in his life. He heard their voices and they whispered ideas to him which he wrote down in his notebook. But at the same time, his mind was filling with fear and paranoia. One night, Daniel noticed that one of the figures he had created, a mysterious woman named Evelyn, began to haunt him. He could see her shadow in the corners of the room, hear her laughter, and it made him shiver. He couldn't tell if it was real or a figment of his imagination. Daniel decided to perform the ritual described in the book to free himself from this obsession. He gathered candles and prepared everything he needed. At midnight, with his heart pounding with fear, he began to recite the incantation. Suddenly the room brightened and shadows began to dance across the walls. Evelyn appeared before him, her eyes glowing, and she spoke. "You summoned me, Daniel. You cannot escape me." As if under the influence of magic, Daniel felt his body become uncontrollable and his mind filled with her voice. He realized he'd become her puppet, and everything he'd written was just a reflection of her wishes. The next morning, Jason came to see him again. He was alarmed by the lack of news from Daniel. When he opened the door, he saw that the room was a mess. A finished manuscript lay on the table, but instead of the usual text, there were only screams and pleas for help. "Daniel! Are you here?" Jason shouted, but there was no response. Suddenly he noticed a shadow sliding along the wall. It was Evelyn. She smiled, and Jason realized that his friend was lost forever. Despite his best efforts, no one had been able to find Daniel. His novel was published, but it wasn't what readers expected. It was a story of madness, obsession, and the dark forces that can take over a writer's soul. Readers throughout the town of Blackville were captivated, but no one knew the price Daniel paid for his art. Now, when someone opens a Daniel Cartwright book, a chill hangs in the air and shadows begin to whisper. Every reader risks becoming part of this dark story, as Evelyn is still waiting for the next victim of her obsessive writer.